Okay.
Well, welcome everybody to this DPN webinar. My name's Robert Bond and I'm going to be moderating today. The topic is record of processing activities, how to revive your RoPA. We've got a tremendous number of attendees registered, which I think indicates that this is going to be a good topic. I will just confirm, because I see we've had a question, that this will be recorded. And so the recording will be available, and I'm sure that Simon from DPN Associates will be able to just say a few more words about that. So welcome everyone, and if we could move to the next slide, please, Simon, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're in a different time zone. Good to be here with you today. Yeah, so obviously we're going to talk about the records of processing, but I'll quickly introduce myself and the organisation. So, Data Protection Network, for those who've not been on one of our webinars before, we're a data protection consultancy, so we help lots of businesses, large and small, to solve all their data protection challenges. Equally, we have an insight business too, that we publish lots of articles and guides. Like recently, we published additional guides, and we've got something coming out on subject access requests shortly. We do lots of training, and we produce various events like these webinars. So that's DPN. Myself, I've been in. I'm really a career data marketer. I'd been for many years, and then I moved into the data protection world something like 8 or 9 years ago now, something like that, working with DPN, and obviously work with a wide range of different clients. So that's me. If I pass back over to Robert, I think Robert's going to introduce our sponsor now, OneTrust.
Yes, and once again, many thanks to OneTrust for sponsoring this webinar. As you can see, and you all know, they're one of the fastest growing companies and are very, very involved in this particular area with many customers using their solutions and their tools, not just in the pure data protection area, but also in related areas of ethics and compliance. I'm going to get in a moment Joe to introduce himself, but once again, thanks very much to OneTrust for their input here. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Joe, do you want to introduce yourself, and then Natasha, and then I'll just say a few words about me?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Robert, and thank you for that introduction to OneTrust. So I'm Joseph Byrne. I'm a Principal Solutions Engineer at OneTrust, and my typical role is to articulate the value of the OneTrust solution, but that's not what we're doing today. Today we're discussing topical areas in privacy, which is something I also get heavily involved in, speaking at events and understanding the privacy landscape. Just last week I was at Reading, and next week I will be in Copenhagen. So yeah, delighted to be here. It's a really topical issue, records of processing activities. I was speaking to a client about this just before this meeting as well. So very interested to discuss with the others and how we can put some energy into that.
Thank you. And Natasha, over to you.
Hi there, everyone. So I'm Natasha Warner. I am Head of Privacy and Information Management at Direct Line Group. Most of you will be familiar with Direct Line Group, but for those maybe internationally, Direct Line Group is a insurance organisation. So we have an enormous amount of personal data. And I head up our first line of defence team, who basically support the business in embedding privacy by design, managing all of our sort of compliance obligations, including the RoPA. So this is a very important topic for us, and hopefully I can bring a bit of real life situation to the discussion.
Thank you. And just a little bit about me before I hand over to Simon. So I'm interested in the topic today, not just because I'm involved as an advisor with DPN, but also because I'm a part-time data protection officer for Uniper, which is a global energy company, and we spend a phenomenal amount of time focusing on the RoPA. and I'll probably throw my penny's worth in as we go through the panel questions, which I'm going to be moderating.
Please do, Robert.
So, thank you. And I also recently became a solicitor with privacy partnership law, where I'm working part-time. So I've got lots of different hats at the moment. Okay, sorry, over to you, Simon.
Okay, yeah, great. So I'm just going to spend just the next few moments just kind of outlining what we're going to cover today and take you through kind of some of the scene setting more than anything. So we're going to be looking first, I think, at kind of data mapping and the requirements that we have for record keeping and the record of processing under GDPR. Then we'll move on to looking at kind of what good looks like, so depending on the kind of organization that you have and whether it's a smaller organization with quite straightforward processing, perhaps to larger, more complex organizations. Hopefully we'll gain from the panel some good tips on how to navigate the various challenges that are involved and some good discussion, I think, around that. And I think, as Robert said, we've also had a good number of questions already in advance, on this topic. It was very good that when you registered for the webinar, we've got some great questions. Thank you. But just a reminder that there is also a chat function on here. You can see if you want to click on the chat button, you can also give your question here and send it forward to us, to the panel. So we'll try and get through as many as we can within the time that we have available. So just to tackle that first thing then about data mapping and record keeping requirements. We've just got a slide on screen here for you just to take you through kind of what the key requirements are here. So really around data mapping, we're talking here about doing a review and an audit of the data that you have across your organization, really to confirm what data assets you have and whereabouts they're located and how really they flow from place to place from between different systems. So kind of what personal data in particular you hold, but again, information audit quite often will look at all sorts of data that you have, not just the personal data. But for this purposes of today, obviously we're focusing on the personal data. And in particular then identifying the sensitivity of that data, whether there's what kinds of data that you have that might be classed as special category data or be particularly sensitive in some way. We're looking at how that's collected, whether it's collected directly or through third parties. And again, when it was collected is going to be salient, and the kind of systems that it's held on and the data flows really between those systems. So really that would go into what we would normally call an information asset register. So we'll come back to that in a few moments. But then specifically, if we look at the record keeping requirements that we have under GDPR for the record of processing activity, our focus today, what we're looking at for record keeping is really focusing in on the purposes that we're using personal data, narrowing in on that, and looking at whether for those activities, are we acting as a controller? Are we perhaps a joint controller with another organization? Or are we acting as a processor where we're acting solely on behalf of another organization? Within that, we'll be looking at things like the categories of individuals that we have and the categories of their personal data that we have, the lawful basis. So which lawful basis are we using for each particular activity that we're using the data for? Any transfers that we have to third countries, obviously a more complex thing that's been over the last couple of years with Schrems 2. So we're looking to understand where data is being transferred to. And also the transfer mechanisms that we're using for that and the safeguards that we'd have in place. Then something that actually it shines a light, I think, when you're looking at records of processing is what retention measures do we have in place? How long are we keeping the data for the specified purposes, and whether we're actively cleansing that data at the end of the period that when we no longer need it. And of course, with an eye on our systems really and our operating processes, looking at the technical and the organizational measures that we have to make sure that we're keeping that data safe and protected. And then finally, just there's some additional things that I'm not covering absolutely everything in the record keeping requirements, but these are probably the core things. One more particular thing that is really a best practice thing to have on your records is to have links in there, links maybe to your contracts with third parties, links to your records of consent, data breach records, and any assessments that you have, DPIAs, LIAs, those kind of things. So from there, it's not all organizations are required to carry out and to have a record of processing. There is actually an exemption under GDPR for organizations that have got fewer than 250 employees. These exemptions may apply. So if it's unlikely to pose a risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals, if it doesn't include special category or criminal convictions data, or is only done occasionally. So again, some organisations may be able to benefit from those exemptions. Having said that, there's still a great benefit in doing an activity like this, because it really helps you to understand what your data is, where it is, and how you're using it. So it's still beneficial for many smaller organisations to conduct a record of processing. So I think what we'll drill into today is what kind of challenges do organisations face, and certainly from the survey that we did very recently, just in January, we identified that it was it probably was actually the biggest area that organisations were struggling with from the feedback we had. So looking at again, data mapping processes, how we can go about that, what options we have for mapping the data. And I think we had lots of questions on the next topic, which was proportionate ways to manage your records and getting a sustainable approach. How do we go about managing this for different types of organisation? Should we use technology? What are the benefits? Should we consider doing it via technology, or should we use maybe the Excel spreadsheets, the kind of templates that the ICO and other regulators have put forward for records? One of the other challenges is how we engage people across the business. How do we get our stakeholders to work with us? Because at the end of the day, they know what data we have, they know what they're processing and how they're using it. So that's something we'll talk about, I think. Talk about the practical challenges of managing a project across the organization with such kind of scope to be able to identify the data that you have, and again, what we're using it for and all the things that you require for a record of processing. And finally, just some ways to make it more useful. Once you've got that, what other ways are organisations finding benefit from the records? So that's about it. I think at that point we come back to the panel, and we can, Robert, I'll hand you back to you, and we can start the discussion. I can't hear you, Robert.
Yeah. A couple of questions come in while you were talking, Simon. I'll get back to those, but one of them was, can you explain what is only done occasionally? I'm not going to ask the panel to immediately answer that, but I was going to say that that question about what is only done occasionally dovetails into one of the main topics we're going to talk about, and that is that, as Simon said, the RoPA is a very good risk management tool. It's almost easier to accept you should use a RoPA than to find an argument as to why you don't need to. And even small organizations, I think, can find it as a very useful tool, because it sits in amongst all of the other accountability exercises that I think we should be dealing with. So the question that we've had is, how do those different accountability measures, like the privacy notice, like the data retention policy, like the information asset register, how do they interrelate and fit together? And I'm going to turn first to Natasha to look at this with your experience, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think whenever you start thinking about the RoPA, the key to it is really to think of it, it's the most useful tool to help you understand your data. So whether you're a small or a large organization, and I'm certainly Direct Line Group is a fairly large organization, to understand what our compliance obligations are for protecting our data, we have to thoroughly understand our data. And so it's really important, therefore, to have a sort of comprehensive and a good overview of that, and to have an accurate documentation so that we can base other areas of our compliance, such as the privacy notice. We can accurately reflect what we're using data for and how we're transferring it to places, etc. We can't comply if we don't understand from our RoPA what information we have. And then we have to, the tip's already been made, but make that a useful tool. So what we've done at Direct Line Group is during GDPR, we actually started off with an information audit, like many organisations do, reaching out to the business and saying, what data do you have? Why do you have it? What are you using it for? So that we could meet those compliance obligations. But as we've progressed, what we've done is we've moved it to a GRC tool that then helps us to assess risk as it happens with the business. So any change project is going through our GRC tool process, and we're assessing what's the data we're using, why are we using it, so that we can link it to the contracts with third parties, so that we can link it to our privacy notice, and everything is automatically being updated and working together alongside itself. And that's working for us in a really practical and useful way. So yeah, I think key is absolutely making sure it's comprehensive enough to work for you, and then to be able to link to those documents and get those documents to accurately reflect how you're using data and why.
Okay, and Simon, from your experience with the range of organizations that you assist, do you see different ways of developing the RoPA?
Yeah, I think we do actually. So from the point of view of this, I think many will work with a similar kind of set of common goals, very much based on the templates that the ICO have given us. It's very clear what they're looking for us to include within a RoPA. But from that point of view, I think the key thing is this discussion around having a proportionate approach depending on the organization. Is quite, it's a very important question for many people that are asking how can we adapt it to our organization. I think you do have some flexibility to be able to do that. So I think some of the key things to bear in mind is, again, so let's just maybe can pick up on some examples. So there's also within the ICO template, for example, they give you some quite useful examples. There's one in there of human resources, for example. So that might be a good way to talk about kind of how we might use that. So that would include, and I think one of the key things in there is that the way that they document it is that they actually list every category of personal data separately in their example. So they would have things like employee data, they would have bank details, pension details, tax details, contact details, things like that. But they're not quite as clear about the purposes of the processing of that. So it would have things like payroll and personnel file. I say to clients, let's focus very much on the purposes that we're using the data. Let's focus on those, and then the other information that we need will flow out from there. Will in terms of the types of individuals and the types of data that we're using, and we take a very proportionate approach to that depending on the size of the organization. So if it's an organization, say with relatively straightforward processing, that's maybe got 250, 500 individuals in the organization, that can be very different to an organization with 10,000 employees, something like that. Again, might be it also depends, I guess, on the territories that they're covering as well, how broad that processing is and how distributed that might be internationally. So I think having a pragmatic approach is really important for organizations within, of course, the framework that the regulations give us.
Yep, thank you. And several questions have come in, Joe, about are there software tools that enable you to manage the RoPA process, and also the interrelationship between the RoPA and, say, what you put in your privacy notice about lawful grounds and the categories of data subjects and whom you share with and so on?
Yes, certainly. So I can only really talk mainly to our platform, but it was designed around the regulations, in particular Article 30 of the GDPR, to facilitate records of processing activity. And for many organizations, that's the keystone of their privacy program and what they do first. And with that, you can then inform things like your retention schedule and inform your privacy notices as well. And it's something we'll probably come to later today. There's this concept of moving from compliance to intelligence. I was speaking about this just last week, and it's I don't think it's an evolution from compliance to intelligence. I think you go from compliance to then compliant intelligence, where you start to use the data you've put in order for things other than simply being compliant and other than simply keeping records of processing activities. You start to use that data then to inform the business and make make better decisions. So there are certainly tools out there that do all of that and inform all of those things, and they enable you to have what I call joined up thinking. So rather than having these things in separate places and trying to merge or manage the data between them, it can bring that data together for you.
Okay, thank you. And Simon, you mentioned in the introductory slides about, you used the word data or words, data provenance. So can you explain, if you're starting the RoPA process or you're revisiting it, what do we mean by the understanding the data provenance?
Yeah, thanks. The kind of things I'd be looking for, I say once we've identified the different purposes we're using the data for, we want to understand, okay, so what data we're using for that process. So by the provenance, I'd be looking at whether it came direct from the individual. That will be the first thing, really. So whether the individual had provided it directly, and then be looking at kind of to get some measure of the accuracy, integrity, and whether that information was up to date. So to get, again, recency is going to be important for that. If we gathered it just last week versus if we gathered it 5 years ago. And also, I guess, from the provenance point of view, is understanding whether it was gathered indirectly, so via a third-party organisation. So things like what kind of privacy information might have been given to the individual if it was gathered by a third party. Are they aware that we have their data? Those kind of things. So looking really, so provenance, I'm looking more broadly about whether, you know, their level of engagement, interaction with the organisation, the privacy information they've been provided with, the accuracy, and all, you know, a wide range of different things really from that point of view to get an understanding of the level of relationship as well with the individual.
And Natasha, following on from what Simon's saying, in terms of understanding what I call the who, what, when, where, why, and how of everything we're doing, we've had a question in to say, it seems from the RoPAs I've seen, they oftenly focus on the process first rather than the purpose. And we also had a question in advance saying, what do we focus on, the data assets or the business process? What's your experience, Natasha?
So I think for us as a privacy team, we always focus on the purpose. There's data types that are similar being used across the organization for very different purposes, and the ways in which we use that, the ways we protect that, the ways we enable that will inevitably have to be based on what our purpose for processing that data is. So, for example, our pricing teams is an obvious example for an insurance company will have a very different purpose and therefore be allowed to use data types in a very different way from perhaps the marketing team, who will have to be very cognizant of the PECA regulations in terms of how we're contacting customers, etc. So that there are different boundaries for how we use data types depending on what the purpose for processing is. So I think our RoPA is very much driven around the what data have you got and why have you got it, and then branching out from that in terms of, right, so what protections do we need, what enables us to use data in different ways, and how do we update the privacy notice accordingly to reflect all of that.
Okay, and again, one of the comments that we've had is around the ICO's template being overly complex for small organizations. I mean, I have to say, wearing my hat as a notary public, where I have no staff, it's only me, but I have a lot of special category data in the nature of what I do, and the law requires me to keep certain documents forever. I've got to have a RoPA, but I've found it's not been that difficult to complete it. Since, you know, once I've understood the who, what, when, where, why, and how of what I've got. So I think it is quite possible to, for a smaller organization, have a more manageable RoPA. And inevitably for a larger organization like yours, Natasha, it is going to expand in different directions, but so it should, because you're handling lots of different data for different purposes, you know, as a large business. What do you think, Joe, is the level of granularity that the average organisation should have when fleshing out the RoPA? How deep do you dive?
Well, I think you should certainly start with a template. The ICO is a great one to start with. There's others available. We have some available in data guidance as well. And the majority of the fields, from what I've seen, they aren't really that complex. Purpose of processing, region, location, these sorts of things. Sometimes it seems like a lot of data, but when you drill into it, it's not perhaps as complex as you think. And maybe just accept the fact that there is a little bit of work involved to get it off the ground in the first instance. And when you come to review, it'll be far less work. But overall, there isn't, I feel, just from the experience I had, an overwhelming amount of information. It just seems like a lot to begin with. So start with a template and populate it for a single process, and then move on from there, I think. Okay.
We had a question in earlier on, which was, you know, if the RoPA is such a valuable tool, and the only people who don't need it are the small organizations with less than 250, etc. Why do we think the DCMS, the government, are looking to get rid of the RoPA? What do you think, Simon?
I think they're looking at potentially, rather than getting rid of it, I think they're just looking at giving organisations more flexibility to be able to tailor it to the type of organisation and the size of organisation. So perhaps it can be less sophisticated. And equally, I think that, you know, because a lot of smaller organisations perceive that as being quite a challenge to get started and get their RoPA going, they're trying to give them a bit more encouragement and give them a bit more flexibility to get started on that. To be able to move it forward, I think. So I think that's kind of where they're coming from. But I expect that many organisations, particularly larger organisations, we're not going to be throwing the RoPA out the window by any means. There's still going to be a great requirement for it, because one of the other core requirements within the proposals that we have from DCMS is to develop these PMPs, or privacy management programs. And from that point of view, you're still going to need just the same to understand the data that you have, and particularly the purposes you're processing it for. Your technical measures, whether it's transferred overseas. I mean, a lot of this is common information that you're going to need, very much as you said, Robert. I think from a risk management point of view, the purpose of doing this is to simply to understand where our risks lie and what potential weaknesses we have in that, and how we can mitigate those risks to protect people. So from that point of view, I think there's still very much going to be a requirement to do it, but I think some flexibility about how organisations do that may well be welcomed by a lot of organisations.
Okay, and let's not forget that before we had the GDPR and we got rid of that requirement to register with the regulator, I remember in the old days that, you know, the ICO had produced an extremely good template. You simply said what your business sector was, and up popped the registration template, in which was a complete description of the typical processing that type of organisation would do. So we haven't moved a million miles away. All that's happened is that the RoPA is an internal document that you only have to produce in anger, I guess. Looking again at it as an internal document, Natasha, do you find that, for example, when you get data subject requests, whether it's erasure or access, do you find that a good RoPA guides you on what the lawful ground was you relied upon when you collected the data, which means you know what you can and cannot say to the data subject, or is that too deep a dive?
I certainly think it gives you the foundations of where to start. I think that as an organisation, we'd probably get a fair quantity of subject access requests, and because of that, we have a team who actually specifically deal with it and are very used to responding to particular types of requests for information. However, the the RoPA is the guide for them, particularly around the links to the retention periods, for example, knowing if we get an erasure request in, how long we are legally obliged to keep hold of that information for purposes of limitation periods, etc. So the RoPA gives them all of that, where there are sort of complexities within the request that they can't possibly have access to off the top of their heads all the time. That they might not consult it with every single request because they're very familiar with responding to rights requests now, but they dip in and out of it on a very regular basis where there's complexities and they want to be certain of what grounds we've relied on or how long we've kept something or where that information has been transferred. And so it gives that concrete reliance for a customer, I think.
Okay, and again, Joe, any thoughts from your side?
Well, it can certainly help inform a data subject access request if we're trying to find out the nature of the processes that data subject, their data was involved with. And we can also automate some of those steps as well. So if it's a request of a particular nature, we tell the system ahead of time where that data is so it can go and find it. So depending on where you are on the automation scale, it can help people find the information themselves, or it can help us prepare the system to find it automatically.
Okay, and Simon, do you find that when you're working with a client on a data protection impact assessment, that the outcome of that you feed into the RoPA?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the ideal way of working. Absolutely, is to get integration of. I think, as Natasha mentioned earlier on, is to link them together, so that you've got a process for. Or first of all, to identify with some new processing. If you've got an existing process, from looking at that, it can help you to, the tools, for example, can help you to identify if you need to carry out the DPIA in the first place. But most certainly, the information that you would gather, understanding, for example, where the data's held, where it's transferred to, any third parties involved, the technical measures that are involved in protecting it, any mitigations that you use. So much of the information is valuable to the RoPA and then should be fed back. So if you can get to a position whereby you can kind of automate that in some way, so that you can get an ongoing update, which I guess is one of the benefits that software can provide, but I think it is technically possible if you didn't use a software solution as well to provide a feedback loop into however else you're storing it. But yeah, certainly that's the way that we try and work with our clients, is to link them together. And if I could just mention from the point that you mentioned before about subject access requests, Robert, I just want to mention one of the other things that's probably worth mentioning with the way you'd refer back to the RoPA would be a data breach.
Yes.
Same sort of situation. If you have a breach of a certain kinds of data, the RoPA can be invaluable for something like that, or a suspected breach. You can track that back and identify, your processors, or if you're a processor yourself, the controllers, and again understand all of the details about how the data is used and the systems it's on, etc. It's a really, really useful tool in that situation.
Yeah, we've got loads of good comments and questions coming in. One of them was, how do you engage the key stakeholders? I'm in a big organization. How do I get people to take part? And if I put my lawyer's hat on, I would say, well, of course, don't forget, not having a RoPA up to date is a breach of the GDPR, for starters. So, if that doesn't get some people's attention, I don't know what does. It's not the 4% category, but it's in the 2% category. But yeah, I'm just intrigued, Natasha, how do you in a large organization get the engagement with other parts of the business in the process?
So I think, similar to you, we probably, in the run up to GDPR, the we need to do this angle was one of the key angles that we went for. However, I think it's developed further, and as our tools being more customized, we've spoken a lot to stakeholders across the business to say, actually, this is also a really useful tool for you. It's not just a useful tool for the data protection officer or the privacy team, but actually for the business as well, in terms of you wanting to understand where your data is or how long you've kept something, or etc. You can then pull down that level of information. You can get MI from it. You can understand all of your third parties from our RoPA that you're dealing with, and when those contracts are expiring in different ways. So the more you get your RoPA with the pragmatic information that you need as an organisation, the more a useful tool that it can be, and the more the business stakeholders can really see the benefits of it.
So we've just had a question: how frequently should we review or audit our RoPA? And what I'm hearing you saying, Natasha, is this is a living, breathing document, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. For us, it is, and that really works well. I mean, what we do have, I mentioned before, we've linked it to our impact assessment process, so our DPIAs as well as our security impact assessment process, and we give it a review period as that goes through. So we give it a grading or a score to say, is it a significant impact or a material impact for the business, etc. And that determines how often we revisit that particular entry in the RoPA or as a DPIA also, to say, has it changed? Is this still accurate? Do we refresh it? So absolutely, it's a living, breathing tool. It's something that we're in and out of constantly without necessarily just thinking of it as a RoPA. It's managing, our governance basically of how we manage personal information across the group. Okay, so there's 2 or 3 questions that seem to me related, Simon, and I'm just going to start with you. So there's can the controller ask to see the processes RoPA? And how does a non-EU UK controller deal with a RoPA if they're caught by, I'm assuming this means Article 3.2?
Yeah, exactly. So on that first one, yeah, I can't see any reason why a controller would not ask a processor for that. I must admit, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of an example of where a controller that I've worked with has asked their processor for the details of their RoPA. They may well have done without my knowledge of that. Might ask Natasha if she's got experience of that one. Actually, that's a good point, because I don't think I've come across an example where a controller specifically has asked for that from their processor, but they've most certainly asked for specific information to enable the controller to complete their records. So if I was doing it that way, then I'd be asking the controller to give me their RoPA so I can fill it in. That seems a good approach.
Yeah, so we would usually be a controller in most situations, but we will ask our processors to demonstrate when we go in to do like third-party audits, etc., that they have got a record of our processing and what data they hold of ours and how that's segregated, etc. So we ask for evidence of that. We might not ask to see their full RoPA, but we'd ask to see it from our point of view and what they had of our own data.
Yeah, and just from my own point of view, I've got a US a research company, aftercare sales. They tend to be working for large tech companies. They've embraced GDPR, and it's part of their, response to FAQs as to, how are you managing our risk? And we go, well, we have a standard RoPA process, and we also have this and we have that, and so they're positively selling that to differentiate themselves from competitors, and it seems to be working. They've grown massively. I suppose the risk is, and Natasha, you were sort of hinting at that, is that the processor's RoPA does contain a lot of information which relates to other controller activities. So there is a confidentiality type issue, I suppose, that has to be considered.
I think that's right.
Are there any good examples of what good looks like in a RoPA? Joe, have you seen templates that are pre-populated for sort of examples for sectors or not?
We have them internally, and when we do demonstrations, we show a complete data map. I don't know if there's any in the wild. It's a difficult one because you're generally dealing with fairly real information and real company names, or it just looks a bit ridiculous if you make up a load of fictitious companies. So I haven't seen any in the wild, but we do have ones we can show people in our demo environments.
Okay, thank you. What somebody's just sent a question in where, in terms of how long do we keep data, is it sufficient to say in line with our data retention policy? Simon?
Yeah. I would say it is, providing you do have it on the retention strategy. That's the key, or not just the strategy, but from the point of view of having a specific schedule that has that line in it. Yeah. That's my worry, to be honest. And I think from my point of view, we're talking about how things map into each other and how the documents link into each other. I like it when they're integrated, when your record of processing has your data retention schedule linked into it, or actually states the data retention period. So from that point of view, I think it's better to do it that way, in my opinion. But I appreciate not all systems will integrate, and you might be holding your your data retention schedule somewhere separately. In which case, you've got a potential system challenge there of can we integrate these two things together? But that's exactly what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to get a clear record of these are all the purposes, and therefore this is the time period that we're storing that information for.
And what do you think, Natasha? Who's responsible for keeping management or keeping the RoPA up to date? DPO?
Sorry, I was going to say, I think it's got to be the business in general, as the controller are accountable for keeping it up to date. They're the people who are using the data, know the data. So a privacy team, a DPO can centralize that and challenge it, can have use it and have an understanding of that, but we really absolutely need the 100% accountability and the engagement of the business to tell us exactly what level of detail, what data they're using and why they're using that, and so it's got to come from them. And
do you spend a lot of time training, educating, coaching those key stakeholders?
Yeah, absolutely. I think continual conversations are required to get people to see the importance of it and to understand why we're doing it, and that we're not trying to put another bureaucratic sort of procedure in place, but actually we're trying to do it in a way that works for the business and is flexible for the business and that they can use as well.
Yeah.
Can I just add something there, Robert, if that's okay?
Sorry?
Could I just add something there?
Yeah, please do.
I find when working with different stakeholders in different functions, part of the tricky area, I guess, for them is the things that they don't have to hand, which might be, for example, an example of that is they often don't have the contracts with third parties to hand. So they're not always stored, again, centrally like you would like. So therefore, some of the questions are harder to answer. And the ones that I find we have to go away and do a bit of more work on after, because quite often we do these via we do these via kind of conference calls. Has been quite a regular way of doing these sort of things with different teams, but having meeting with the team and then documenting the processing after the discussions around it. But the areas that tend to be trickiest are, again, third countries where data is transferred to. Where is the contract? And again, when was the contract last reviewed? The questions that relate around the contract, the technical and organisational measures, which I think we had a question we may touch on, is how we document the technical and the organisational measures. And as we said, the retention periods is the other one that we identify some processing. Maybe there isn't a clear retention period around it. So those are probably the most common areas that I find can be a bit trickier and take a bit more work.
Okay.
I think also the DPO needs to be very visible in the organization. It needs to engage with these teams so that they realize that privacy and RoPA is a going concern for the company. If that isn't very visible or isn't brought to their attention, then people will just do their own thing or maybe try and work around it.
Yep. How do you deal with the departments or business function where there isn't a single source of ownership, Natasha?
I think it's not just having one person within like a department, etc. You're going to need several people, and although you might have one person who is accountable for ensuring that their records in their department is accurate and up to date. It's the people on the ground who are actually collecting and using that data who, you know, you need to be engaging with to fill in the RoPA in the first place, or in our case, our impact assessment that then feed the RoPA. They're the people who know and understand how they're using the data and to need to be responsible for keeping it up to date.
Yeah. And I've had a reminder that the question about how does the RoPA work for a non-UK/EU controller. Again, I was going to say that for my Californian client that started the process, it was a great data gathering exercise to say, you know, whether they were a processor or a controller. Again, do we know what on earth we've got and where we got it from and how long we're keeping it and so on. So it's, even if you're not within the UK, if you're caught by GDPR, you've still got to go through the same process. And we probably, all of us on the panel, say that in real life, when you're completing the RoPA or you're feeding your DPIA into it or you're updating your privacy notice, there will be a light bulb moment when you realize we haven't looked at this.
That happens quite a lot.
We are saying something in our privacy policy that is completely the opposite to what we appear now to be doing in practice. Joe, I think it was, mentioned a little earlier, or maybe it was Simon or both of you, that, you know, the system should also include your data transfers and how you've done risk assessments, as well as how you're doing privacy impact assessments. And I assume that we also now have to think about including in the RoPA how we're managing legitimate interest assessments, where we rely on that ground. And if we look at the Online Safety Act, we're going to have other risk assessments for those organizations that are caught by that legislation. So that it seems very inappropriate to think that we will have businesses do away with this as a tool, because it's so central to everything else that spins around it. It's almost like the RoPA is the engine, isn't it? What do you think, Joe?
I think certainly. And I think for organizations that have interests in Europe, they'll still need to remain GDPR compliant. And one of the debates we were having about the consequence of Brexit, people were saying, does that mean we don't have to do it anymore? And the answer was no, it means you have to do it twice now for many things within privacy. So I think it is, of course, a valuable tool, but if you're working in those markets, it's something you're going to have to do anyway. So I think considering doing away with it altogether, or even toning it down, is probably not the best idea if you have interest in those markets.
Yeah. Any, what have we got? Oh, somebody else has just, again, back to data retention. Processing activities may involve more than one record set. So surely there are differing retention periods. Correct, but if you look at some of the, like the ICO's template, assuming that you have properly defined the set of data and the purposes for which that set of data is being used, you may well have a different, in the retention column, a different record period. Anybody want to disagree with me or add on to that, Simon?
I think that's right, and I think the key thing to bear in mind is that if you're using the same set of data for two different purposes, they may well have different retention periods. In fact, quite often do. So, for example, retail sales, for example, or something that's a product sold online, just the sales process might have a certain period against it. There'll be potentially using the data for complaints management, for example. You might have legal hold that affects them. So things like that, different uses of the same data set may carry different periods. So that's the way I look at it.
Yeah, and we've just had a comment. Is it good practice to get teams across the business to certify the RoPA as an accurate record on a regular basis, maybe annually? How do you approach that, Natasha?
So that's exactly the approach we took originally, was to get, when we did the information audit and the business came back with this is what information we're using and how long for and why. We got the senior people to sort of testify that that was an accurate description of the information that they were holding within the department, and to make sure then that they would keep that up to date. As we've progressed, and I've alluded to a lot, we've made that more of a sort of living tool. We don't get that same attestation. What we do is get assurance against it. So our assurance teams, because I work for a large organisation, we have assurance teams within there who will go in and do a dip check of the department's records to ensure that everything that they're expecting to see is on there on an annual basis. And that works in much the same way. Then if there are any findings, then that would go back up to the person who would have testified to the fact it was accurate and up to date.
Okay, we've got a question that has come in. How do you keep and maintain a RoPA for your website? And I'm just going to comment on this, and that is that we could equally ask the question, how do you maintain a RoPA for your manual data, or for your app, or for your cloud? In other words, it would be, in my view, no different. Your website is simply a touch point for where data comes in and data flows out, much as it would be where you are, you know, at a trade fair and you're collecting business cards, or you're scanning people's badges and QR codes and so on. You're processing. So I'd be wanting to know, what is the website doing? What's being collected through it? What do we say on the website about what we're doing, etc.? Does that sound right to you, Simon?
Yeah, that's spot on, Robert. I think of it exactly the same. That's right. One of the website is just particularly the place where there's an awful lot of touch points with the consumer, but equally there are others. There's often telephone, there's often written correspondence and other ways that individuals engage with organisations. So the website is part of that whole mix, and for many organisations, obviously, it's one of the largest parts of that mix. So it's a key part of it, but the process is just the same, really.
Yeah,
it focuses on what purposes are, is data being processed on that website.
Then we've got another question for global organizations. Would you list every country data is transferred to? What do you do, Natasha?
So I think one of our operations being travel makes it really hard to always list exactly where or the countries that data is being transferred to, because it can be being transferred globally to many different jurisdictions. And so we try to offer those options as a way to enable the business not to have to select multiple jurisdictions, but rather to say, actually, this could go worldwide. But then we also enable the organization to be much more specific where it is to a transfer is to a specific territory, and where we need to do a international transfer assessment, then we'll need much more specific information. And if it is worldwide, then we'll need to understand, well, why could it be going anywhere, and what's the rationale for that?
Yeah. Okay. Anything to add, Joe?
I think it's desirable to track that as much as possible, so you can demonstrate then your cross-border map where the data is going, and that you've got adequate transfer mechanisms in place, and where you don't, maybe you may have to do transfer impact assessments. So I think it's desirable to be able to do that if you can.
Okay. And we've had another question in, how do big hosts like Microsoft and Amazon complete a RoPA in detail when they've no idea at any one time what on earth they are processing for their various customers? Can they just generically describe, we process customers' data, etc., without being detailed? I presume they've got no choice but to do that.
Oh, they should be able to describe the purpose of processing for everything they do. So if you start with a purpose, then you look at the process and then the vendors and assets and work at it that way. There was some discussion about this actually around about the time of GDPR, that some of the big players just weren't going to do it because they thought maybe they were big enough to just carry on. And then I think they suffered some fines and things as well. But I think for any one type, or for any of the data they have to be able to justify why they have it. So although it's maybe a lot of work for them, I don't think they can be too generic.
I think that's right, and I think in where they're contracting with businesses, for example, the big players, then they should be able to document the ways that they contract and the purposes that they're processing individuals' data as part of that. In the same way that other organisations would. I think it's obviously more challenging where they're carrying data as a processor for other organisations, and that may be, if you're providing a software solution, that can be in all shapes and sizes, but that's not really the essence of what we're trying to achieve here. It's the ways that the organisation, be it Microsoft, Google, or whichever, is actually processing the data, is what we're trying, would be the focus there, I think.
One more, I'm just looking at the time. We've got another question about the degree to which technology is an increasingly useful solution in managing this process. Let's start with the tech guy first. Joe, what do you think?
I think what it does, well, there's a couple of things to highlight. One, it makes things much more efficient. It means that once you've captured the data, keeping it up to date is much easier. But one of the other main benefits is that it can make the data work for you. So when something's about to expire or has gone to an unacceptable risk, or perhaps a transfer mechanism has been made invalid, you can tell the system to bring all those things to your attention rather than task some poor individual with trudging through a spreadsheet. So you get a lot of efficiency and you get a lot of insight back from that data using a software solution rather than trying to manage it manually. And it also scales where you're trying to do these things with other methods, or they're not aligned or not joined up. It doesn't scale well with the business.
So what you're saying there, for example, is if in completing aspects of the RoPA, it is obvious that a revisit needs to be made to the retention policy or the privacy notice, that's where you get a prompt?
Yeah, things like that. Or perhaps a contract with a vendor is due to expire, or perhaps we've carried out a privacy impact assessment and that's pushed the level of risk for that process overall to a level that's unacceptable. You can have the system then bring that to your attention rather than having to try and figure a reason it out yourself.
Yeah, okay. Have you looked, Simon, at, or have you suggested to your clients that the RoPA would be useful in anger if there were an investigation as a defence mechanism?
Yes, absolutely. Because again, it's all part of your accountability and evidence for a start. First thing to be able to demonstrate that you have got full understanding of where your data is and what you're doing with it. That's got to be the first thing. So yeah, I'd very much suggest that it would be part of the evidence that you would use if you had an inquiry. Equally, the same thing as we mentioned for a data breach. When you're carrying out subject access requests, when you want to be able to demonstrate that your privacy notice matches the actuality of your processing. So I think, as we said, it's core in many ways, and provision of, it's probably one of the key documents, I would say, for providing us evidence from that point of view, because it's the repository of, it's the foundation stone to some degree. I think somebody said that earlier, but it's the foundation of your processing and where you would record that processing.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and if you look at the ICO's regulatory enforcement policy, it's one of the things they would say good looks like.
They would.
Yeah. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. I wondered, any closing comments? I'll start with Natasha. Any thoughts before we finish?
I think probably brought it to life all the way through is just make it practical. for your organization. You know, don't just have it there as a record that sits in the background, but actually, you know, use it, understand your data, and you'll actually find it an incredibly invaluable tool if you do.
Okay, and Joe, any final comments?
Oh, just that concept I mentioned earlier of compliant intelligence. So compliance is necessary and it's something we have to do, but let's look at how we can get more value out of the data than just being compliant by using our records of processing activities to our advantage in our business.
Okay, and Simon.
Yeah, the only thing I'd just like to add that we've talked about, and Natasha's brought to life, you know, what really good solutions look like, particularly, you know, and in a larger organisation and how mature that process can be. I just think for smaller organisations as well, it's good to bear in mind, and I've seen quite a lot of smaller organisations that maybe have not developed theirs and are using an Excel template sort of version. It's still well worth doing. Absolutely, it's still well worth doing, because it will give you much more understanding of your data. It will enable you to manage your risks so much better. So it's worth putting the time and effort. And I'd also say it's worth considering where you focus the time that you spend on this, focusing on your core teams, spending more time on the core teams and the higher risk processing that you might have within your organisation will certainly, you know, yield the benefits that we've been talking about today. And thanks everyone for listening too, by the way.
And I've just got one more throwaway for particularly you, Simon. And we've had several requests for examples of good RoPA, and I wonder whether offline this is something we might think about doing a round table on. Maybe it's it's another DPN guide.
Maybe it is. Yeah, it's a good point actually, because that is part of the challenge that I think organisations face, is that it's their own. Each organisation is creating their own RoPA and is probably reluctant to share that with others. So if we could find a way of enabling people to share things in a way that is, example data, shall we say, maybe a round table or something that might have legs. Yeah, so I think that's something we'll take away and think about.
Well, I'm going to give Simon the last word just in case there's any admin. But from me, thank you to everybody being on the webinar, and thank you particularly to Joe, Simon, and Natasha. Excellent panel. Simon, anything just before we go off air?
Just a big thank you to you all. Been really interesting discussion. So thanks Robert, Joe, and Natasha. And also just a reminder that the recording is available tomorrow if anybody wants to listen again or share it with colleagues. We will provide the recording about 4 p.m. UK time tomorrow, and hope you've all found it useful. Thanks ever so much for listening.